The Vikings detested Christianity simply for its own sake, wanting to wipe the faith from the face of the earth, right? Well, of course, it's common knowledge that the Vikings hated Christianity. Everyone knows that. Isn't it obvious? After all, they destroyed churches and monasteries, abbeys and nunneries everywhere they went. They looted every church building they could find, leaping off their fearsome dragon-headed ships and heading straight for the nearest church. What could be clearer evidence than that of their hatred for the faith? Admittedly, at one time, the available evidence also dictated that the earth was flat. I mean, it looked flat, so it was flat. Well, as in the case of the flat earth, evidence can often be very misleading. If you simply look at something that occurred, taking it at face value, seeing it for what it was as such, without also looking at why it occurred, how it occurred, even where it occurred. And often, the vital ingredient is who wrote about it. What is the source of the information on which you base your ideas? Who were the witnesses? Well, hello and welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. Now, the supposed Viking hatred of Christianity is largely due to a combination of circumstances related to how their raiding was carried out, the purpose of it, matters relating to their own safety as they did it, and perhaps most important of all, who wrote it down for us to read centuries later. I think it was Napoleon who said that history is written by the victors. And that, of course, is perfectly true. Most accounts of warfare down through the ages have been written by those who won, since, well, they tended to be the ones who were still alive afterwards. So all atrocities, all brutal massacres, all rape and pillage was done by them, the other lot, not by us. Yes, they were totally cruel and devoid of decency, while we fought nobly and heroically to defeat their evil. We committed no war crimes. We fought with honor. Well, they killed innocent civilians. But didn't you also kill innocent civilians? Quite often, actually. Well, yes, of course. We had to do it, you see, to stop them doing it. Yes. Well, you see, so it is with the Vikings. That the Vikings had an all-consuming detestation for Christians, a total abhorrence of them for no reason other than the fact that they were Christians. Well, that's as much of a myth as the horned helmet. They didn't wear horned helmets, and they didn't have a special overwhelming desire to rid the world of Christians. Nor, for that matter, were they actually the brutal, unthinking killers they are so often depicted as being, though brutality was naturally a part of raiding, regardless of who was doing it. If people resist guys with axes and swords who want something that they have, well, those people are going to get hurt. There really isn't such a thing as a peaceful, non-harming, gentle raid. I say, you Anglo-Saxon person, I would like all your gold and silver. Would you mind putting it in this bag for me? Oh, certainly, old chap. Glad to oblige. Drop in for a chat any time you're passing, won't you? No, that didn't really happen, regardless of who was doing the raiding and who was being raided. The raiders and the raidees, you might say. The truth is that the Vikings were no more brutal than anyone else from the 8th to the 11th century, or indeed through the rest of the Middle Ages. It was an often violent and brutal time. Situations could escalate very quickly when most people carried weapons of some kind. Even women would generally have carried a knife. But the Vikings, they were not at the pinnacle of violence committed for no valid reason. Certainly not as brutal as had been the Roman legions of several centuries earlier, who would simply kill everything living that happened to get in their way, human or animal, until an officer told them to stop. The Vikings, they had no interest in wholesale slaughter of entire villages or towns simply for its own sake, or obliterating a whole city from the face of the earth, as the Romans did at Carthage. Their savagery, it paled into insignificance beside the brutality of the noble knights of Europe a few hundred years later during the Crusades, when atrocities became so bad that even chroniclers of that time, well used to brutality, were shocked by the unparalleled slaughter that ended the siege of Jerusalem. The Vikings, well, they hardly came close to the Spanish Inquisition. They didn't burn people at the stake in the town square for not thinking the same way they did, after all. And the 20th century, supposedly very civilized, The 20th century produced the most brutal, inhuman savagery of any war in history. Yet despite that, it is the Vikings who are portrayed as the very symbols of cruelty and wanton destruction, the epitome of violence perpetrated against hapless people, principally Christians, when in reality they were really just about average in brutality at that time. They just did it with more style. And they would have done it pretty much the same regardless of the religious beliefs of those they raided, Jews, Muslims, other pagans, or even atheists. It would have been all the same. We want something you have, and if you won't give it to us, well, we'll change your mind by burying an axe in your head. They were not driven to wild excesses of wanton savagery by other people's beliefs. Their violence was almost totally related to obtaining things they wanted, and regardless of who owned those things. And when they fought other Vikings, yes, they actually did that, they were just as aggressive and brutal as when they carried out raids. People often see them as the Vikings. In other words, all one group acting in unison. But it wasn't like that at all. They didn't all come from one place. They came from different countries, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, which in itself led to conflict. As when in the sagas, Ragnar Lothbrok's second wife, Oslo, leads an army to attack Sweden. One lot of Vikings going to beat the crap out of another lot of Vikings. Or here in Ireland, where rival Viking groups often clashed with each other as well as the native Irish, such as the time when there was a battle in Dundalk Bay between rival factions of Danes and Norwegians. And sometimes they allied themselves with local Irish chieftains, helping them to fight other Irish chieftains, and then their Irish allies would help them fight other Vikings. Even within the various Scandinavian countries, there were local tribal disputes, arguments between rival jarls or kings who claimed land that belonged to somebody else, or quarrelled over ownership of goods or trading rights, and of course blood feuds, which once started would continue almost indefinitely. You killed my relative, so I kill one of yours. Yes, but then you have to avenge that killing by killing another one of mine, which forces me to avenge that by killing one of yours, and then well, you get the idea. Blood feuds could be self-perpetuating. That's all very well, but what about all the destruction of churches, the looting of holy places? What about, yes, churches were looted and burned, rather frequently. That wasn't motivated by religious intolerance. It was just common sense. Would a burglar today pass the home of a wealthy person, that big house with a Lamborghini and a Rolls Royce parked outside, and a swimming pool in the back garden, clearly containing the most valuable of items, and then they go and break into a dilapidated, run-down house with dirty, ragged curtains on the windows in the poorest part of town, with nothing of any real value in it, nothing even worth the trouble of taking it to the pawn shop? Of course not. Burglars aren't stupid, nor were the Vikings. They went to where the most valuable things were to be had in the fastest possible time with the least risk in obtaining them. Get in fast, get out fast. And where was that? Where would they find wealth that was easy to get, pretty much just lying there unguarded and waiting to be taken? The Christian church. I've mentioned understanding the why, how, where, and who wrote it. So, firstly, the why. Most of the wealth of that time was held by the church. Many bishops were better off than the kings they served. Nobles gave gifts of money and land to the church. Even poor people made offerings in the hope of better things in the hereafter. A copper penny or a bit of hack silver might get you a better seat in heaven. So the church became incredibly wealthy. Rulers like King Alfred the Great of Wessex, a very pious man who spent a lot of his time on his knees in churches, he gave huge sums to the archbishops and bishops, gifted large tracts of valuable land to them, often spending more money on establishing churches and monasteries than actually doing anything for the poor and needy. The church expected donations from rich and poor alike. The former, well, because they could afford it, and the latter because it was good for their souls. It demonstrated their piety, even if they had almost nothing, but still giving to God, or well, at least giving to the church on God's behalf. The church could even confiscate land and goods under certain circumstances and receive payments from people to obtain forgiveness for some offense or to settle a dispute. For that reason, churches and monastic institutions were filled with gold and silver objects, often decorated with precious stones, crosses, candlesticks, chests full of coins, bejeweled vestments. That was where the wealth of the time was to be found, all very conveniently contained in quite small buildings, guarded, if you want to use that word, by unarmed priests and monks, or sometimes nuns. The phrase, like taking candy from a baby, comes to mind. Raid a church or a monastery and you could gather up a whole shipload of valuables without any real resistance, other than perhaps being prayed at, and you could be gone before the local thane could gather his men and arrive on the scene. That is why Vikings targeted churches and other ecclesiastical buildings. It had nothing whatsoever to do with their attitude to the Christian religion. And had all the wealth of the time been held by, say, the Jews and the Muslims, well, Viking raiders would have ignored Christian churches. They'd have walked straight past them, and they would have attacked synagogues and mosques. And of course, today, people would say, just as incorrectly, that the Norse hated Judaism and Islam, and they wanted to wipe those faiths from the face of the earth. That is the why these raids occurred as they did. Now, as to the how they were carried out. The first real raid to the west by the Norse occurred in 793 AD, when the monastic settlement on the island of Lindisfarne, or Lindisfarne as it is today, in the kingdom of Northumbria was attacked, looted and burned, destroying the much venerated shrine of St. Cuthbert, an event that sent panic and anger through the Anglo-Saxons, who railed at the dreadful barbarity of these evil pagans, destroying St. Cuthbert's shrine. Oh, that raid marks the official start of the Viking Age, an age that will continue until 1066 AD, ending, well, officially at least, with the death of King Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, though minor raiding still continued on a reduced scale for some time after that, before eventually dying out altogether. But the success of the raids and the ease with which they were carried out was due to the famous or infamous longship, capable of considerable speed, coming in fast to attack and probably even faster to get away again, having a low draft so it could sail up shallow rivers and strike deep inland just as easily as it could attack coastal targets. It only needed 3 feet of water under it, and being the same at both ends, it could reverse direction almost instantly in an emergency by the rowers simply turning around on their benches and rowing the other way. It could make a fast getaway using oars and the sail. And for a long time, neither the Anglo-Saxons, the Scots, the Irish, nor the Franks had suitably fast ships that could pursue it. It was the perfect ship for raiders. Strike fast, loot fast, get away fast was the general rule, though there were occasions when raiders would stay for longer periods, sometimes even acquiring horses and spreading out from a beach or a riverbank. That was the how. As to the where, well, basically anywhere. Anywhere that lay on the coast or up a river 3 feet deep or more, be it in England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, Francia, Spain, or Italy. Nowhere was safe from Viking raids, even if it lay far inland, hundreds of miles up a river. If there was water anywhere near it, then it was at risk. And in all of those countries, wealth could be found, most abundantly and least guarded in churches. There you are. And now, perhaps the most important aspect of understanding the legacy of supposed inhuman barbarity associated with the Vikings. Who wrote about it? In those days, monasteries were the centers of learning across Europe. They contained libraries. They provided tuition, though usually emphasizing religious subjects. And that was because it was generally only priests and monks who could read and write. It would often be a monk or a priest who would act as a scribe for a king or noble, taking down dictated letters or drafting legal documents and the like, since not all the nobility even were fully literate. So the early accounts of the Viking raids, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or the Annals of Ulster, were written by priests and monks. And who were the most frequent victims of Viking raids? Yes, priests and monks. Now, if you want a fair, totally unbiased view of, let us say, a criminal's reasons for having mugged someone, it's really not a good idea to give that task to someone who's just been battered and bruised by a mugger, at least when they get out of hospital and can actually write something. It's fair to say you will not get an unbiased opinion. So too a monk, surveying his burning monastery with all its treasures now disappearing over the horizon in a long ship, he really is not the person best suited to writing a fair, balanced account of it, weighing up all the reasons why they did it and trying to understand their point of view. No, he sees empty coffers, burning buildings, and a few dead bodies lying around. He doesn't really care if the Norse read poetry, sniffed pretty flowers, and loved fluffy little kittens. He is really pissed off. And they were pagans. Oh yes, they were pagans, which meant they were servants of Satan to begin with, bound for the fires of hell. And thus it was obvious that they would hate the church. They were the servants of Satan, after all, clearly doing his bidding, destroying holy places and taking sacred objects. Maybe taking those sacred objects to use them in vile satanic rituals. Of course they strike at holy places. It was clear as day that these ungodly heathens perpetrated their vile acts against God's holy church in the name of Satan. So that really pissed off Monk writes down an account based on that thinking, and probably greatly exaggerated to get the point over of just how evil they really were. That is where the idea of uncontrolled, excessive brutality, particularly against anything Christian, actually comes from, rather than from any genuine historical fact. Now, that's not the same as saying the Norse loved Christians like brothers. There were always those who disliked them, just as some members of all religions throughout history disliked other faiths for one reason or another. And Christian attitudes to the pagans didn't really help in that regard. I mean, pagans never really cared what God or gods other people worshipped, just as long as those people didn't try to make them worship them too. Now, I saw it very well put by one writer who said that the Vikings were very tolerant of other people's gods. They might even convert to worshipping those gods by their own choice. But if you tried to force them to worship other gods, well, you'd find an axe 5 inches inside your head. Good point. They didn't send out missionaries to try to convert others to their own beliefs, as the Christians did, nor burn people at the stake for not doing it. They were actually very tolerant of other beliefs, which is shown very clearly here in Ireland, where Norse settlers were quite happy to trade with the native Irish, intermarry with them, and convert to their religion. And indeed, by the early 11th century, Christianity had become a major religion among the Norse settlers in Ireland. Generations of Irish schoolchildren were taught how the great, good, and ever so pious King Brian Boru fought the Battle of Clontarf on Good Friday in the year 1014 AD to drive the pagans from Holy Mother Ireland, saving this country from the barbaric heathens. He drove the Danes from Ireland. Yeah, very romantic. A pity it wasn't true, but anyway, it's a nice story. In actual fact, King Brian didn't give a rat's ass about driving anybody out of anywhere, pagans or otherwise. He simply wanted to grab the kingdom of Dublin for himself. And by that time, much of the Norse population were actually Christians, so he couldn't really be driving the pagans out, even if he'd wanted to. Even the King of Dublin, Cedric Olafsson, known as Silkbeard, was himself a Christian. He later founded Dublin's Christ Church Cathedral, and the Dublin Irish fought alongside the Norse against Brian. See, the Norse Kingdom of Dublin was a great prize, which is why Brian wanted it, since not only did it extend across an area roughly from modern-day Balbriggan to Wicklow, but it also included a considerable area of Western England as well, from present-day Liverpool right up to the Scottish border at Carlisle, thanks to powerful Norse kings who had ruled in Dublin, such as the famous Ivar in Bainlassi or Ivar the Boneless. Norse control of Dublin, or Difflin as it was then, actually continued long after the Battle of Clontarf, which had supposedly, driven out the pagans from Ireland, extending on and off right up to the Norman invasion of Ireland in the late 12th century, with the Norse having been Christians for a very long time by then. That says a lot about their attitudes towards Christianity, as does Iceland. In the year 1000 AD, Iceland converted to Christianity, pretty much in one day. Pagan one day, Christian the next. King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, a rather brutal man who really liked to get his own way regardless, bringing Christianity to his realm by, torturing or killing those who refused to convert, which is, that is quite a good way sometimes to change people's minds. And he wanted to convert Iceland as well. So, being the charming man that he was, he didn't just ask them nicely if they'd like to follow the new faith. Would you like to be Christians by any chance? Oh, no. He closed Norwegian ports to Icelandic ships, threatened to kill hostages he was holding. And he was assisted by the fact that other Christian countries didn't want to trade with Iceland, because trade with pagans was actually forbidden by the church. Iceland faced ruin. Most things they needed had to be imported. So without trade, they faced a dismal future. Iceland would actually have ceased to exist. So the matter was put to the law speaker of the Althing, the gathering at which matters were discussed, laws made, and so on. And all the nobles, the jarls, agreed to abide by his decision. His decision? Given the circumstances, hardly a surprising one. Iceland would become Christian, but anybody who wanted to stay pagan could do so. Just do it in private. Instant conversion of a whole country, just like that. Not really based, of course, on any actual religious belief, obviously, but done out of necessity. As I say, there was no real religious conviction behind it. There couldn't be, based as it was solely on the decision of one man, the law speaker, on behalf of the whole country. But it shows that Norse attitudes towards Christianity were not as violent and all-hating as is often thought. Become a Christian? Never. I'd rather die before I kneel to that nailed God. No, it was more like, I need trade with Norway or I starve. But tell me what I need to believe to get trade. I'll believe it. But Christian attitudes towards them, well, that was very different, as we've seen. And that intolerance had a lot to do with Viking reprisals against the church. Those that sometimes went beyond mere looting, and the violence actually required to do that. Such as the occasion when Armagh, the ecclesiastical capital of Ireland, was sacked in 852 AD, and its monastery, dedicated to St. Patrick, burned. When a Viking leader offered up a blood sacrifice to Odin on the church altar to demonstrate that their gods were superior to the nailed God of the Christians. Now, had the church not regarded the Norse, and all pagans for that matter, as evil followers of Satan and tried to either convert or kill them if they refused to accept baptism, it's very unlikely the Vikings would have reacted in that way. After all, if nobody had claimed that the Christian God was superior to Odin, well, there'd be no need to prove he wasn't by a sacrifice on his own altar, would there? That's just simple logic. But then I suppose bringing logic into historical things, that just complicates things. If you've enjoyed this video, well, please like, and hopefully you'll subscribe to my channel. That really is a big help on YouTube. And, a share would be greatly appreciated also, I assure you. So, that's really all there is to say for the moment. Until the next time, farewell, and thanks very much for watching this video. Bye for now.